Namaste. Welcome to the August event of Indic Forum. Indic Forum is a non-profit based in California which promotes Indian history, culture, and dharma for the last many years. Every month, we conduct an event where we bring intellectuals, published authors, and researchers to present their work. Those who would like to donate to us can find the donation link on our website, indicforum.org. We also have our YouTube channel that will stream all our events live. We request you to subscribe to that channel as well. Please note that this event is being recorded. Our today's guest is Krishna Maheshwari ji. He is well known among the followers of Dharma as founder of Hindupedia, online encyclopedia of Hindu Dharma. He has co-founded several Hindu organizations in the past, including Cornell Hindu Student Council, Chinmay Mission Seattle, ISKCON Bhakti Vriksha Programs, and Yoga Bharati Seattle. He is an invited speaker on Hindu topics at conferences across the US. He has an MBA from Harvard Business School, Masters and Bachelors from Cornell University in Computer Engineering and Computer Science. Today, however, he is here to talk about his book, Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children, a Francophone Post-Colonial Analysis, co-authored with Kundan Singh. This book delves into the psychological and social impact on Indian American children when they encounter school textbook narratives on Hinduism and ancient India. The book explores how these narratives, often shaped by colonial perspectives, can lead to feelings of alienation, shame, and identity confusion among Indian American children. It sheds light on the often overlooked experiences of Indian American children and offers valuable insights for educators, policymakers, and anyone interested in understanding the complexities of identity formation in a multicultural society. The audience can ask questions in the chat to make it an interactive session. At the end of the talk, we will reserve some time for questions as well. Having said that, I will now give the floor to Krishna ji. Krishna ji, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and namaste. I'm happy to be here. Let me just share screen. We'll start just by a little bit of an introduction in terms of, here we go. In terms of Hindupedia, who we are, what we do. We'll talk a little bit about Hindu representation in academia. And then we'll start diving a little bit deeper into that topic and looking at the narrative around Hindu Dharma and the founder of that narrative and the paradigm determiner for us and our identity formation. A man by the name of James Mill. We'll look at how we did the analysis and we'll conclude with collaboration opportunities and a link to the book. So Hindupedia is an online encyclopedia. That is how we're seen and we're known. What's unique about Hindupedia is that it is academically accepted. There are over 100 citations of peer-reviewed papers as per Google Scholar that point to Hindupedia as an encyclopedia. And that is our distinguishing trait, and that is who we target. It is intellectuals and academics and students doing research in academic settings. The first book we published was Making Children Hindu-Phobic, which is the first ever critical review of a children's instructional materials that have been published, and in this case specifically McGraw-Hill, and the textbooks that were approved for California for grades 6 and 7, and how they covered India and Hindu Dharma. This book was written targeting primarily activists, because what we wanted to do was facilitate change in textbooks. We had just concluded the process in California, and this was the outcome for the victor in California, which is McGraw-Hill. Just context-wise, we had succeeded in getting Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, the world's largest publisher of children's instructional materials, effectively banned. They lost approximately 55% market share and 14% of their market capitalization at the time of the decision, and more as the revenue loss was realized. The second largest publisher, however, was McGraw-Hill, and they were the victor out of that process because they saw a market where 55% of the market share was theirs for the taking, and they took most of it. So that's who this book targeted. And it has been used in a number of different states across the US, including Texas, Georgia, New York, and Massachusetts, to try to affect change by various different Hindu groups. The focus today is Colonial Discourse and the Suffering of Indian American Children. This book is a little bit different than most because it came through a process of peer review and the academic publishing wing of Palgrave Macmillan. It's also available via open access. And again, we'll share the link in the chat and a QR code at the end. So you can download a copy of the PDF freely, which makes it easy to read. But this book was an attempt to take what we had won in California from 2015 to 2018, which I just talked about, and make sure we didn't step back over the coming 10 years. And we took a turn we didn't expect to take because somewhere along the way, we ran into James Mill and all our timelines got thrown away and the focus of the work changed dramatically. I think this still does achieve its original goals, but it goes much, much further than that. And we'll talk about that. Now, one thing that is important to note, the book includes the topic of suffering of Indian American children. You'll notice the topic on the title slide was the suffering of Indians. And that's very intentional. This book is broken into 6 chapters. The first 4 are for Indians globally, every single one of us. And the last 2 relate to Indian American children specifically. And so for the purpose of today's talk, we're focusing on the first 4 chapters and not the last 2. Now, if we look at the political reality of scholarship as it applies in our context, which is social studies and social sciences, Western scholarship largely is the authority. And Western scholarship is both the system as well as the location. So if you think about authority models, academics in the US are somewhere here, academics in Europe are somewhere here, academics in India are somewhere over here, as long as, and we're talking again in the Western university and scholarship model. Somewhere way below here is where traditional scholarship fits. They're seen largely as illegitimate, false, mythical, violent, and many other synonyms. And traditional scholarship includes Indian traditional scholarship, but is not limited to Indian traditional scholarship. But in the Indian context, those are our gurus, our sannyasis, our Vedantins, our sampradayas, our mutts, our gurukuls, etc. They basically have 0 standing. Now, if we look at what happens in the classroom, and then we look at popular media, we look at news, and we can all see the anti-Hindu narrative, the anti-Hindu presentation of Hindu Dharma. But what we don't understand is that its basis lies in academia. Because at the end of the day, no one likes to say, I am a hateful person. I am a racist person. That's very hard to do psychologically. On the other hand, it's very easy to point to the experts and what they say and repeat what the experts say. And as long as you're doing that, you're not a racist. That's just fact. And it's fact by an expert. Now, when we look at academia, we know there are at least 2,000 professors that are known to support anti-Hindu efforts. And we also know that the environment in academia is very, very acidic. And what happens is professors who want to work in the field of social studies, specifically about Hindu Dharma, they sit on the side and they study and work on obscure topics that doesn't engage or change the narrative on anything. If they want to go and focus on core topics that have direct impact on the narrative, they find their careers very short-lived. They find themselves sidelined, and they find themselves suddenly not on the tenure track. And this is something I've seen building academic coalitions over the last few years. I've talked to hundreds of different academics, and I've talked to academics in the US and India. And as long as we're in the Western university model, this is largely true. There may be pockets where this is not, in India specifically, but by and large, this is true. Now, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and so I still use these pictures. This is how Houghton Mifflin Harcourt and Discovery Education described India and Hindu Dharma. These images were used in sixth grade textbooks for about a decade. They were removed in 2018, but the narrative still hasn't changed, and this is still the thing that's discussed. But this isn't it. It goes on to talk about the fact that Hinduism is a recent invention. It's based on a ragtag collection of many religions. The core of Hindu Dharma is caste, which means hierarchy and oppression. In other words, we, as in the majority of Hindus, discriminate in a negative sense against the majority of our brethren. It's not limited to just us generally. Civilizationally, our kings have been authoritative and oppressive. Buddhism is seen as emancipatory and liberatory. In other words, it's an improvement on Hindu Dharma. And when Hindu epics are discussed, they're discussed in casteist lens, which again forces students and the rest of us to conflate them with hierarchy and oppression. Now, this is the narrative from textbooks, but keep in mind, this is not only in textbooks. This is the narrative that we see and hear in all facets of life in various different ways and in many different subsets, depending on the specifics of the location and the format. Whether you go into media narratives, whether you go into movies, whether you're going into other forms of books and print media, it's the same. Now, the book is titled Colonialism, so we have to talk about what colonialism is, and this really sets the stage for why we have what we have. When we think about colonialism, we think about it as geographical and political control. And what that means is India got freedom in the 40s, and therefore we're no longer colonized. Unfortunately, that is not the full extent of colonialism. Colonialism was a systematic and a systemic intervention in colonized knowledge systems and culture. It was epistemic violence and epistemological violence. It was an attack on our way of knowledge, our process of teaching knowledge, and our process of developing knowledge. And the attack's goal was to mold, deform, twist, transform, and destroy, and to leave nothing behind other than the knowledge systems and culture of the colonizer. And as colonization started to secede, we saw the emergence of the field of post-colonial studies, which is fundamentally about uncovering these colonial perversions so that post-colonial societies could heal. It was largely broken into two subcategories, Francophone and Anglophone. Simply put, the Anglophones wrote in English and the Francophones wrote in French. Now, there's one other key difference, and this is not a strict rule, but by and large true. The Anglophones focused on the economic impact of colonization, and the Francophones focused on the psychological impact of colonization. There's been a lot of work done on the economic impact of colonization, and that has entered public discourse for quite some time. The psychological discourse, unfortunately, their psychological impact has not been discussed. And that's what we're going to focus on today, and we focus on in this book. The other thing to note is post-colonial studies largely excludes India and Hindu Dharma, almost by definition. And the reason for that is because we as Indians and as Hindus simply haven't participated. And so no one else did on our behalf either. And hence it doesn't include us. And that changes with this book. Now, to understand the fundamentals or the reasons behind why we have the discourse, we have to go into a little bit of British history and a man by the name of James Mill. James Mill was a disciple of Bentham, who is seen as the founder of utilitarianism and was a giant in his own right. Unfortunately for James Mill, his son, John Stuart Mill, was also a massive intellectual in his own right and wrote many, many famous works. And so James Mill, unfortunately for us, was sandwiched in the middle between two very famous personalities that were very important in British history. Now, James Mill wasn't just a disciple of Bentham and an active political reformer who did a great many things for British government that were to the benefit of the British government. But he was also the author of a 3-volume work entitled History of British India, which was published in 1807. And that book led to his joining and his rise in the British East India Company. And he took on, before the end of his life, a position that was effectively the head of the British East India Company, reporting only to the board in Britain. Now, this is a man that never went to India. And in the introduction of this 3-volume work, states there's more to learn about India in his closet than there is in all of India. He is also someone who we call as a paradigm determiner. Now, as part of his work at the British East India Company, he ensured that his work, this 3-volume British history, History of British India, was taught at East India College. East India College was the very first university that had a full-fledged India Indology program. But the other important thing was this was the place where every administrator in the East India Company came to study before they were deputed to India. Now, this program was then lifted as Oxford and Cambridge started those programs, their program around India, and then was taken to the rest of the world. And so whatever he wrote in this 3-volume work became the foundation for India studies globally. Now, James Mill himself was also a prolific writer. Not only did he author History of British India, he wrote articles on education, on governance, on jurisprudence, on the press and their liberty, on prisons, on the clergy, etc. Now, if you look at the timelines and when these were published starting almost 12 years after the History of British India. Now, we do know some of these thoughts came out earlier than these articles. We were able to trace that. But we also have to understand some additional context around Britain. In 1807, the libel laws were such that if you wanted to talk about the British government, if you wanted to talk about the aristocracy, if you wanted to talk about the clergy, in the ways that he wanted to talk about them, using the language he wanted to use, he would have been thrown in jail for libel. And so that was not a good way for him to drive reform, because he was first and foremost a reformer, a political reformer in Britain, trying to push forward the utilitarian agenda of his mentor, Bentham. And so what you'll see as we go through this presentation is he took what he wanted to write about Britain, but put it in an Indian context. Now, we don't refute the work in the History of British India. Instead, we do have footnotes from someone else who tried to correct him. That person had spent 30 years in India. He had come back. And yet, even he couldn't actually revise the History of British India. All he could do is footnote all his corrections, and the 3-volume work with his footnotes became a 7-volume work. But he had to stand by the core messaging of James Mill. This is the power that the book itself had taken after its publishing. Now, when we go and study from an academic perspective, we have to use a number of different tools to analyze. And so we used Professor Singh's theorems of binaries, which he's been developing for a number of years. And he has a book that's come out on top of it separately that just came out. We use 3 different authors, Césaire, Memmi, and Vernon, and their works. And then we use James Mill's writings himself. So we can see what he thought about India and what he thought about Britain and British politics. And now one thing from Bal Gangadhar Ji is that colonialism is fundamentally a view into the colonizer. Now, when Bal Gangadhar Ji writes, he talks about it in the context of Orientalism. But if we did a find and replace all on Orientalism with colonialism, it fits perfectly in our context. And so I'll read Bal Gangadhar Ji here with this one change. Colonialism refers not only to how Europe experienced the Orient, but how it gave expression to that experience. In doing so, Western culture built and elaborated on conceptual frameworks using resources available from its own culture. You can read through the rest, but fundamentally, when we see the output from the colonial experience, we see output from colonial thought. You can learn more about the colonist than about the colonizer by reading it. And you'll see how this is true of James Mill. Now, I have a bunch of extracts here from his work and then the history of British India, and you can start seeing the types of projections that he made. Now, projection here is a specific psychological term, which talks about how he communicated what he wanted to talk about in Britain, but overlaid and exaggerated in the context of India so he could make his point. So in this case, he's talking about the clergy in Britain and then projecting that onto the Brahmins in India. In the paper Ecclesiastical Establishments, he writes, in ecclesiastical language, the wealth and the power of the clergy are religion. Be as treacherous, be as dishonest, be as unfeeling, and crueling, be as profligate as you please. You may still be religious. But breathe on the interests of the clergy, make them surmise discredit at your hands, and you are the enemy of religion directly, nay, the enemy of your God. Now, when he looks on India and the Brahmins, what he has to say is the priesthood is generally found to usurp the greatest authority in the lowest state of society. The Brahmins among the Hindus have acquired and maintained an authority more exalted, more commanding, and extensive than the priests have been able to engross among any other portion of mankind. He goes on to say that the distance between the Brahmin and Bhagwan is as great as the distance between the Brahmin and the rest of humans in India, across all of the different varnas. He continues about the clergy and the church and its reform. The divine author of our religion everywhere indicates his opinion that praying is nothing but ceremony. You can read the rest of the quote, but if we go on and look at what he has to say about India, when the exaggerations of flattery are engrafted upon the original deification of the elements and powers of nature, then is produced that heterogeneous and monstrous compound which has formed the religious creed of so great a portion of the human race, but composes a more stupendous mass in Hindustan than any other country. The absurdity, the folly of the endless ceremonies in which the practical part of the Hindu religion consists. So again, because he's attacking ceremony and praying as ceremony in Christianity, he's now starting to exaggerate on ceremony in Hindu Dharma. If we continue on this article, he talks about morality. We've often asked ourselves after hearing such a sermon, and he's referring to the Sunday sermon at church every week, whether any human being could possibly have received one useful impression from it. He keeps going on, but fundamentally, the sermons are useless. They're useless because they don't change the morality of the people. And that, in his mind, is the purpose of religion. Now, when we look at India and Hinduism, no circumstances connected with a religious system more decidedly pronounces on its character than the ideas which it inculcates respecting merit and demerit, purity and impurity, innocence and guilt. And where, with no more attention to morality than the exigencies and laws of human nature force upon the attention of the rudest tribes, the sacred duties are made to consist in frivolous observances. There we may be assured the religious ideas of the people are barbarous. So again, he's attacking us on the fact that whatever we teach has nothing related to morality within Hinduism. Now, the other thing I'd like you to notice on this is some very specific terminology around merit and demerit, purity and impurity. These things you will continue to see in the narrative that we see around us today. One of the biggest things, or the most frequently occurring parts of the narratives when it talks about Brahmins, is the concept of purity and impurity. When he goes on to talk about aristocracy in an article on the government, which again relates to Britain, whenever the powers of government are placed in any hands other than those of the community, whether those of one man of a few or of several. Now, one man here is the king, the few or the several is the aristocracy. Those principles of human nature which imply that the government is at all necessary imply that those persons will make use of them to defeat the very end for which government exists. That end, in his mind, is to serve the people. We have also seen that the interest of the king and of the governing aristocracy is directly the reverse. It is to have unlimited power over the rest of the community and use it for their own advantage. Now, when he goes and talks about Hindu aristocracy, he talks specifically about the king. Among the Hindus, the government was monarchical, and with the usual exception of religion and its ministers, absolute. In the first place, there are hardly any laws, and he, meaning the king, alone is entitled to judge, and who is entitled to legislate, and he must make a law for every occasion. In other words, his decision is an exercise of arbitrary will and power. Now, if you step back from here and look at what we have today, we have a prime minister that is openly Hindu. Now, I'm not making a political comment here, but if you look critically at the narrative around the present government of India, what you will see is that it is seen as a Hindu king, right? Or specifically, the prime minister is the closest analogy we have to a Hindu king. And then if you critically examine the narrative around the present government, you will start seeing this sort of narrative emerge. In the article entitled Jurisprudence, which talks about the law, civil code, penal code, and the code of procedure, he talks about the concepts of completeness and exactness. Completeness refers to the things that have to be encoded, and exactness to the form. And he says two things over and over again. First, all the rights that are required to improve a society, they need to be written down. And all the acts that hurt society also need to be written down, but in such a way that the penalty for doing those are the minimum possible in order to prevent them from happening. Anything that's extra with regards to these two is extraneous. Further, powers, privileges, and offenses and acts all need to be subdivided into some set of optimal classes, and these classes need to be clearly defined with the greatest clarity and certainty, and no ambiguity whatsoever. And again, punishments need to be the minimal possible amount that is required to prevent the negative things that hurt society. And then he goes on and talks about judiciary and the fact that it has to have rules and guidance needs to be written down and laws need to be written down, or not laws, the judgments need to be written down. And then he goes and tortures the Manusmriti, pulls things out of context, specifically so he can make the point that India has no jurisprudence. From the opinion of the Hindus that the divine being dictated all their laws, they acknowledge nothing as law, but that what is found in one or other of their sacred books. In one sense, all of their laws are written. In other words, they're complete. But as the passages which can be collected from these books leaves many parts of the field of law untouched, in these parts, the defect must be supplied either by custom or the momentary will of the judge. In other words, the laws are vague and indeterminate in Shastra and can have one or several meanings. And those meanings are often contradictory and opposed to one another. In other words, does it matter if it was written or not? If it was complete, then everything is written, but given the level of vagueness and given the level of contradiction, it might as well not have been written down at all because it's meaningless and therefore entirely incomplete. Then he goes on, but as kings and their great deputies exercise the principal functions of judicature, they were too powerful to be restrained by regard to what others had done before them. In other words, when they made a judgment, it was arbitrary. And it was, on the face of it, dependent on the person that showed up and the mood that they woke up with that morning. They were not bound to make the same judgment in two different cases that were pertaining to the exact same thing. One happened to have been seen yesterday, the other today. It didn't matter. They could do whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, completely arbitrarily. Now, when he goes on to talk about exactness, Hindu law departs widely from exactness in every one of the particulars wherein exactness consists. It creates a great many rights which ought to have no existence, and acts which ought not to be erected into offenses, and it does so over and over again, too many times. There's simply too much extraneous matter. Further, he goes, the division and the arrangement of the matters, from his perspective, are highly imperfect. The definitions are far from excluding darkness and doubt, and they leave everything in doubt. It's all indefinite and all uncertain. The punishments aren't repressed. In other words, they're excessive. And they're excessive in quantities and quality. And the form of the judicatory is bad because nothing is written down and nothing is regulated. Everything is completely arbitrary. When he goes to talk about taxation, again, now in the context of Britain, in the article named Summary Review of the Conduct and Measures of the Seventh Imperial Parliament, he talks about the power enjoyed by a particular class of making laws to take so much annually from the property of every man. And specifically, the great evil of this mode of satisfying the aristocracy with the property of the people is that it takes from the people more than it gives to the aristocracy. Now he goes on to say, to tax so heavily, you need pretexts. People need to feel like this is required, otherwise they will rebel. And so the way that that pretext is provided is twofold. One, colonization itself. We need to go support the colonies and to control the colonies, and that needs money and that needs taxes. And the other is the army. And then when you look at the army, and you look at the senior people in the army that take the majority of that public money, they're also members of the aristocracy. And so the aristocracy pockets what they do of the public money because that is their motivation. It's to make themselves wealthier and to consolidate power. When he goes and talks about India, he says the sovereigns in India had not only the ownership, but all the benefit of the land. The ryots had merely the privilege of employing their labor upon the same soil, not transforming that privilege to some other person. The sovereign claimed the right to as much of the produce as he pleased, and seldom left the ryots more than a very scanty reward for their labor. So again, the taxes in India are arbitrary, and they're excessive, and they're collected by the king, and very little is left for the people. So with this, I'll conclude on James Mill directly. What you get is a flavor of how he projected onto India. Now, again, we didn't try to correct. He had already been discredited in the footnotes of his own work a couple of decades later. At the same time, it didn't matter. He had set the paradigm, and that paradigm was established and rolled out and continues today. Now, we think in general that these things only happen to us, and we stand alone in the world, suffering from this colonial discourse. But when we look broadly across academia, we see that we were not alone, and others have had similar experiences, and we're going to talk about them. We looked at the works of Césaire, Fanon, and Memmi. Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, and Albert Memmi, and some of their works. Discourse on Colonialism from Aimé Césaire, Black Skin and White Mask by Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, again by Frantz Fanon, Albert Memmi's work called Racism, and The Colonizer and the Colonized. Now, all three authors were focused towards French colonization in Northern Africa. Their work was focused on Algeria and Tunisia specifically. Now, while we focused on these authors have been used broadly in many different post-colonial societies to start the healing process on their own. We, however, have not done that until this book came out. And so what we wanted to do was share some of the tools and help us understand how we're not alone in the experiences that we have. And our colonial experience here isn't unique. And when you look across all of these works, there are a couple of themes that emerge. There's a dialectical relationship that's created between the colonizer and the colonized. And the goal of colonization is to fabricate attributes of the colonized, but claiming rationality and objectivity. In other words, not only is this the expert opinion, this is scientific, this is rational, this is reasoned. This is not an emotional reaction. This is not a fabrication. And fundamentally, it's about assuaging the guilt of the colonizer themselves. How can they bring colonization to how can they bring civilization to an already civilized world? That doesn't make sense. They can bring civilization to an uncivilized world. Now, to bring civilization to an uncivilized world, they have to prove that the world that they're coming to is not civilized. Now, I'm sitting in California, so we also have to look at this from an American perspective. And that American perspective was the white man's burden in American history to bring Christianity and civilization to the rest of the US as it stands today, from just the 13 colonies. But fundamentally, what they do in assuaging this guilt is dehumanizing, animalizing, and objectifying the colonized people. And fundamentally, this is racism at its core. Now, all of this can be claimed on India, and we do in the book, but for the purposes of today, all of these are things that came from Memi Césaire and Fernand with regards to Tunisia and Algeria, because this is the experience that they had and their people had and what they were talking about. So now what is racism? Racism is the generalizing definition and valuation of differences, whether real or imaginary, to the advantage of the one defining and deploying them, and to the detriment of the one subjected to the act of definition. This purpose is to justify social or physical hostility and assault. Now, if we look at the colonial narrative itself, and we look at the colonizer, if they were white, then the colonized were consistently dark and black. If they had the idea of civilization, then the colonized was savage and barbaric. If the colonizer was cultured, then the colonized were animals and subhuman. If the colonized were the creators of order, then the colonized were creators of chaos. And if the colonizer were messengers of God, then the colonized were children of evil. These are themes that repeat over and over again. But one thing I forgot to add when we talk about the colonial narrative and we talk about the colonized experience, we're focused very specifically on European colonization. Now, in the context of India, there were two waves of attack in India, and the second was the European colonizer. And so that's where we're focused, not on the first. And here in Tunisia and Algeria, it was the same. It was European colonization and French colonization that was being discussed, but applies equally to all European colonizers. Now, even in the context of India, even though these comments were made in the context of Northern Africa, if we think about how we think about beauty, it is not dark skin, it is not black skin, it's white skin. And we think about savagery and barbaricness, or animals and subhuman chaos, and how we've been portrayed. You see that in many different places. You can even look at it in terms of policy and laws, and some of the laws that were made around practices in Hindu Dharma. Now, the colonizer has to justify to himself and to the colonized why he is doing what he's doing. But in order to do that, he has to extinguish the memory of the history and identity of the colonized. He has to create laws, morals, false history in its place. And then through words, laws, books, and media, dehumanize the colonized. And then finally, he'll make public show of his virtues. How many of us have heard about in the Indian context how important English as a language was post-independence for India, or our legacy of the Indian railways that came from the British. These are examples of public shows of virtue meant to justify the act of colonization. Now, the scholarly work is also very interesting, but fundamentally it's motivated research. And in France, a Dr. Gustave Le Bon proved physiologically that the prefrontal cortex was underdeveloped in Algerians. And as a consequence, they weren't intellectually capable of self-governance. Proved. Now, fundamentally, this type of colonial scholarly work is motivated research. It removes consistently history and time and evolution from the study of the colonized. In other words, you take history and all sorts of output of civilization across all time and flatten it into one, and then look at it from that perspective, ignoring the time element altogether. And then they're pushing for outright destruction and erasure. For example, the culture and intellectual contributions of Egypt and Nubia have been almost entirely removed from European history. You only see it mentioned in the context of Egypt, but no influence, no trade, nothing in European history. And their goal is to legitimize their fabrications. And they do that by creating vast lexicons of official words, gestures, administrative texts, and political conduct. They create organizations to institute those fabrications in the society of the colonized. And then they create a colonized intellectual class to perpetuate these fabrications. And again, these are observances in Northern Africa, but equally applicable to India. We see the institutions, we see those colonized intellectuals created even during the period of colonization itself. Now, once physical colonization has ended, once Britain left India, and in this case, the French left Tunisia and Algeria, what they observed was the colonized intellectuals continue long after their masters have gone. Fundamentally, they're filling a gap left behind these colonizers, but they were also the beneficiaries of colonial machinery, which continued to run after the departure of the colonizer. And those people didn't know any better. The entire education and political experience that they had was in the colonial framework. Now, if we come back to India, the entire political experience and the colonial framework around education that we have remains largely untouched, despite so many years of independence. And so our collective experience is that of the colonized. And so we are all collectively still colonized. Now, what's the psychological impact? It creates feelings of inferiority. And from there, what you think is everything good comes from the white world. And you start associating with that world through an inner whiteness that's developed. And inwardly disassociating with your own people and culture. And you saw this with the protests of Hindus for Palestine, but yet not a word for what is happening in Bangladesh from the same people. In common parlance, we call these people coconuts. You're brown on the outside, sure, in the Indian context, but white on the inside. Vernon called us black skin and white masks because the black people in Northern Africa had this inner whiteness, which he refers to as the white mask. Now, there's a thumb rule of psychology that gets applied. The repressed and unconscious has to get projected onto a scapegoat. And in this case, evil and darkness got projected onto all of the non-European people of color to varying degrees. And evil largely became symbolized by the black man, or the dark-skinned man. Now, fundamentally, when we look at colonial discourse, it is racist at its core. It talks about the superiority of the white race over non-white races. It's a substantial part and a significant feature of the colonial system with three components. There's a gulf between the culture of the colonized and the colonizer. This gulf is exploited for the benefit of the colonizer. And the use of these differences as standards of absolute fact. And then this is ingrained in actions, institutions, and in the nature of the colonial methods of production and exchange. In other words, every single talking point in exchange with the colonizer has this racism embedded in it in some facet or another. And what they do is fundamentally describe their victim as incomprehensible, impenetrable, mysterious, strange, disturbing, etc., fundamentally making the colonized an animal, a thing, or a symbol. So if we summarize these three authors, what we find is that European colonizers spent a lot of time, money, energy, and intellectual power in characterizing the colonized as an uncivilized primitive and savage society, and at the same measure, described themselves as civilized. They constructed the colonized in every country as barbarian and uncivilized, and created a dialectical relationship between themselves. In other words, for them to be good, the colonized had to be bad, and the worse the colonizers were, the better they were. And so they portrayed themselves as civilized and the colonized as savage in as many ways as possible. These racist misrepresentations were generated. And alongside of it, they created all sorts of myths. And unfortunately, because they had sociological and institutionalized control, those myths became fact. And in the Indian context, our Shastra became myth. Now, they also provided intellectual and scholarly rationale for the continued colonization, even after the physical and political colonization ended, because the colonized intellectuals that they left behind continued to perpetuate the same same colonization, same approach to colonization, and the same narrative post that political freedom that was achieved. And we see that even in India today. So with that, I'll conclude. This book is available online. It's available through open access. So we posted the direct link to Springer, which is the publisher. You also have this QR code, which takes you to the same place. With that, let's open up to any questions. Go ahead, Rajivji.
Yeah, so it's a fascinating work here. I mean, I have like a dozen questions, but I'll just try to ask one or two. So one is the definition of racism. It's very interesting. But I see like in the like the definitional analysis, I see like it's a template that has been copied from Christianity or Abrahamism. I mean, I feel so. So if you agree with that, my question is why that connection has been so unexplored and kind of forgotten.
So the colonial experience is rooted in Christianity, right? Because the European colonizers were Christian. So there is clearly a connection there. And then if you go further, what we explore is that connection with Christianity, and it goes through a different framework, one of binaries that we use to go there. And you see two different treatments of Indian Hinduism, through the Romantics and then through rationale, right? Rationality or the Enlightenment frameworks. Now, the colonial experience happened in the Enlightenment framework, the Enlightenment framework, which focused on rationality. And so if you think about what Christianity and what was happening to Christianity during that period, and you overlay that on top of what is happening in the colonial experience, you can start mapping that out. Because the Enlightenment positioned the mind above God, you start seeing that mapping play out here. Now, why hasn't this been explored is a good question. I think a lot of it has in the works of Memmi, Césaire, and Fanon, but not so much in the Anglophone sphere. Now, in terms of India and Hindu Dharma and the impact here, none of it has been explored. The psychological angle itself has simply not been explored before this work. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I somehow, I mean, I think there is a deficit, even in like the Western scholarly world. If scholars are true to their enquiry or the spirit of enquiry, I think that connection has been deprecated. So why so? I mean, that is my question. That probably very few have answered. You have tried answering here, but I'm looking at the underlying causation of that disconnect.
Yeah, so I'll leave you with this slide at the very beginning, which is against one of the assumptions that you just stated.
Right.
right? That scholars are not removed from the political reality and the religious reality in which they exist, which is why you can have the context of an anti-Hindu scholar and why Hindu scholarship, when applied to Hindu practitioners as scholars, are seen as not as good as non-Hindu scholars when studying Hindu Dharma. But when it comes to other religions, Islamic scholars hold the pen for Islamic studies, and Christian scholars hold the pen on Christian studies. That is not the case here. So the level of removal or independence from Christianity that you're assuming in scholarship simply doesn't exist.
Okay. Yeah, my second question is like what about the Indian scholars or Indian intellectuals, or you can call them like Brahman Varna? See, any crackpot can come and start giving their version of you. But what was that deficit in you that you just accepted it, internalized it, and then now you are intellectually persecuting your own people? What happened to that, the famed Indian scholarship or the famed argumentative Indians in Amrit Sen's speak? Why such one way internalization of what the colonialists thought about you?
Yeah, so the answer is easiest put when we remove India from the context. Right? This is why we talk about Césaire, Fanon, and Memmi. Because they didn't talk about India. But everything you're talking about, they talked about in an African context, a Northern African context. So what worked in Northern Africa also worked in India, and it was the same. Now, there were some additional things that were done in the context of India that perhaps were done to differing degrees in Africa, specifically targeting our intellectuals, but it's not like the intellectuals in Africa were not targeted also. Maybe they were targeted differently. This is the feature, the defining feature of colonization. And it is the institutional control and the development of this inner whiteness, right? He calls it black skin, white mass. I call it coconut because that's what we use for Indians. That's the term, but it's the same. So our intellectuals, and I won't go so far as say the Brahmin Varna as a whole, but our intellectuals are white on the inside if they belong to the Western model of scholarship. Now, if they don't, they probably still are to some level of coconut because that's, again, we all experience a colonial scholarship. But the traditional scholarship has no sway. They have no stance, they have no meaning. And we ourselves, by and large as a people, belittle it. I just came back from India. I spent a month. I talked to a lot of traditional scholars. And one of them runs a Gurukul in Banaras. And what he was telling me is when students come to a Gurukul to study, that is because they could not cut it in a standard Western school in India. Then they come. So the lowest caliber of students come here because this is seen as the lowest caliber of education. So again, even our traditional teaching grounds are belittled by society, and they barely exist today because of this inner whiteness that drives us towards Western scholarship, Western models of education.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, we'll have to have more conversations like this in large numbers to even go into the causation. But this is a very, very great effort on your part. Yeah, thank you. I'll let others now ask questions.
Can I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Yeah, in the popular mind in India, I come from the state of Punjab. There is very little ill will towards the British or towards the white man. Now you contrast that with the colonized experience of the Islam or Muslims in India, certainly in North Indian state of Punjab that I originate from, there is ill will about Muslim occupation of India. So if the British experience has been so bad as you portray in this lecture, how come it doesn't affect the popular imagination in India?
So it does, actually. But it's the internalization, which is the reason that you don't see that negative perspective. Remember, everything that is good is seen as to come from the white world as an outcome of colonization, European colonization specifically. And if you look at skin tones across India, some of the whitest folks are the Punjabis. So that they're the closest to achieving the outer whiteness as their inner whiteness. So they were impacted a little bit less than the rest of us. We didn't go into the study of Islamic occupation of India. I do understand it to a certain extent, but comparing it here wouldn't quite be the right thing to do, given we're talking about European colonization. But what I will say is there's a layered effect and a recency bias. And also the forms of colonization impacted different parts of society more, for psychologically speaking, not physically or economically speaking. The British targeted the intellectuals. And the colonizers in general, including Northern Africa, targeted the intellectuals. Again, a defining feature of European colonization here. And the Islamic occupation did not target the intellectual class. They tended to target the political class, the ruling class. So they were targeting different part of society altogether. And so when we go look at the outcomes of Islamic occupation of India and the British colonization of India, and you look at systems of knowledge and process of transferring and developing knowledge, right? The epistemology and the epistemological process and systems. Those were not shattered during Islamic occupation. Those have been shattered coming out of British colonization.
Okay.
May I?
Go ahead.
So I do understand that very, very well read and analytically very superior thoughts have been applied to this subject. But my query would be very simple. What steps do we at this stage in life take to see that the next generation is not white inside?
That is a very deep question, Rajeshji, and one that's come up many times, even over the last month, as I've been traveling and talking about this work. And the way we look at it is there are two things that need to happen. We have started the process of deconstruction, which is starting the process to analyze and break into its constituent components the narrative that we have today. And I say start because I do mean start. There's a lot more work to be done. And the reason this is important is because if you do reconstruction without it, what you end up is reacting to the current narrative. And a reaction is better than nothing, but it's also not fully correct. And if you look at the policies over the last 5 years, maybe 7 years of the Indian government, they're reactions. They're not from the standpoint of our own center of gravity. And so we need to speed up deconstruction. And we need your support and support from a lot of other folks to get there. You also need to do reconstruction. That is also an equal need, but recognize at some point that reconstruction is reactive and at some point needs to transition to being in your own center of gravity. And from the very beginning, like if you want to talk about immediate next generation and not the time it takes to do deconstruction, reconstruction, then it starts with simple changes. Whatever traditional knowledge systems that remain, whatever Shastra that remain, give them authority as a starting point. Trust until verified as wrong, instead of believing they're wrong until someone verifies they're right using Western epistemology. Give them authority, give them standing, give them respect. Be willing to send your kids to a Gurukul in equal measure as any other school. Be willing to take Shastra as authoritative and not just one specific Shastra, not just Bhagavad Gita, all Shastra as authoritative until someone proves otherwise, using any epistemology. Only then can you move forward to start the change that you're talking about.
Well, thank you. I do not know how much I will manage, but I will also try to start.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Is your scholarship an example of wokeness? You know, the things that are white and American and British and all that are bad, and other nationality, other cultures are better. So wokeness has many different dimensions. Would your scholarship fit into this wokeness? This woke scholarship?
It's a good question. Now, what I will say is Professor Singh and I don't ascribe to the binaries of the left or the right. Even if you look across India and the US, that binary doesn't make sense. Modi ji and the BJP government is considered the right in India and is lefter than the Democratic Party in the US. So sitting in the US, they're actually a very left party. So that binary simply doesn't make sense. And from the standing point of Hindu Dharma, it also doesn't, because our texts extol us to rise above and beyond the binaries. And what that does is leave us open to explore scholarship and explore tools that are available everywhere. We don't find ourselves limited to tools of the left or tools of the right. Now, in this case, the scholarship of Césaire, Memmi, and Fernon has evolved into wokeness and critical race theory specifically. And that's okay. That is where that scholarship went. But we are still free to use that base scholarship for the betterment of our own people, which is what we've done. So I will not call our work in the category of woke, because I think that category is irrelevant relative to our work. But our work and race theory and its derivatives have a certain commonality in scholarship history and lineage.
Thank you.
There were few questions similar to the one being asked, and Krishna ji has already answered. Any last question?
So, namaste. This is Richa.
Namaste.
Hi. So, I wrote some questions in the chat, but I guess I'll just ask one question that always bothers me, given the fact that you've discussed Africa versus India. The African continent also underwent similar theories like the Aryan invasion or Aryan migration theory, like the Hamitic hypothesis, is the core biblical concept that drives the entire colonial framework and narrative there, right? It did for a long time, and then now nobody talks of the Hamitic hypothesis, whereas the AIT has now converted into AMT. And that narrative is being in fact reinforced very strongly now, and they have revised it and of course, Aryans from Iran is the key, is now, instead of the Caucasus Aryans or the, people from Central Asia, there's a new concept coming up, which is more, closer home in Persia. So I don't know what you think of that, and is there a way to dismantle, and why is it continuing? I think is a bigger question. Why are they putting so much force and effort into this revisionist
Yeah,
history?
it's not revisionist history. It's fabricated history,
Right.
right? And like I said, scholarly work is a key facet of colonialism and colonial thought. Remember, Dr. Gustavo Le Bon proved that the Algerians had an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex physiologically, right? And similarly, the Aryan invasion theory was similarly fabricated and came through a number of evolutions, right? It's now down to the spread of Indo-European languages as the current version of it. But it is fundamentally a political and racist theory coming out of colonization and the colonial output. And until that power imbalance is seen and understood, and the political motivation is understood, no amount of fact will kill that theory. No amount of counter propositions will kill that theory, because it's not fundamentally based on science, despite the amount and depth of scholarly work surrounding it. And so if you ask me, the correct answer, there is a great number of people working on disproving its variations, and there is value to that. But an equal amount of emphasis needs to be created in creating and fixing our own anchor dates in Indian history. And as we understand our own history better, it becomes irrelevant. And once it becomes irrelevant, then the politics of it doesn't matter anymore. But while we're focused on it, we're unable to move and anchor our own key events in history and our key people in history. And that hurts us. And at the same time, we discredit our own historical documents, which also gives credence to alternate theories that come from outside. Why is Mahabharat not itihas? Why is it not history? And I'm just giving one example of many. And so suddenly, if you can dissect our own historical documents and label them as myth, you open yourselves up to all sorts of fabrications. And that's what we've done. And now we're busy fighting the fabrications.
Right. If I may continue that point, what you just said, that we need to build our own history, right? We need to build our own narrative and accept, what is now. What I think people are doing that too. That Mahabharata is not a myth and it is history. I think that is being clearly discussed now. I think Vikram Sampatji is doing a significant work in India, setting up institutional, an institution, so to speak, that will work to decipher our history from an emic perspective. I don't know if we can replicate something here in the United States as a diaspora to do some work. Do you think that is relevant, given the fact that history does come top down from academic institutions in the United States and percolates down to India as well? I think we are still reading a lot of European and colonized history in India.
Yeah, and this is the reason Hindupedia was founded, was to make sure we had our own perspective reflected in academia instead of the hateful perspective that we see. And Hindupedia in its entirety is focused specifically with this agenda. It starts with an encyclopedia that's scholarly accepted in academic contexts and continues with our academic papers and books. And I'd welcome anyone else to join us in that endeavor, either as part of Hindupedia or as friends outside. doing independent work. But there's a lot of work to do here, a lot.
Yes, thank you. I think
I joined the discussion rather late. Can you describe your own credentials, or are they given here somewhere for me to view?
Yeah, so I think we can post a link to my bio. But I'm the founder of Hindupedia. We as an organization are focused on correcting Hindumesia and providing Indic perspectives or Edic perspectives on Hindu Dharma in academia. We publish an online encyclopedia that's accepted in academia. Colonial Discourse is a peer-reviewed academic book. My own credentials, I have an MBA from Harvard University, a master's and an undergraduate degree from Cornell University. And I've been working on this for a long time.
Thank you. Interesting.
One last question. I don't know if we have time or not. Um, my I too joined in a little late, but I was able to get snippets of your slide, and it's very informative at the same time. Just now we are scratching the surface. When we have so many outside lobbies, anti-Hindu lobbies, folks from, we have talked about this. There is so much of money poured in to dismantle, to change our mindset, and even a little bit of pride that we have sort of regained with our shastras, we are taking it back. It still gets thwarted halfway. So it is almost like it's almost like, I know that we have to always reference Bhagavad Gita and say that, don't look for the fruits, but are there any low hanging fruits or low hanging things that we can achieve? I know you said that it starts with family and owning our culture and claiming what our beliefs are, but when it goes to our kids and their exposure into their school colleges, it further dwindles down. So anything low hanging that you think we can concentrate or try to achieve?
What I would say is, rather than looking at low hanging, think about the leverage and strategic approaches to corrections. Right? Because as a broader Hindu society, we're busy playing whack-a-mole, if you're familiar with that reference.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Sometimes there's Ganesha on chaddis and Krishna on chappals, and then you get the various media representations, and you also get silence on topics. And we're always reacting. And what I wish there was more of, and I find myself alone in, is being proactive and doing deep research that can drive outsized returns. So I didn't talk about this much, but in the California context, the Hindu community has engaged in textbook revision twice. First in 2005 through 2008 or 2007, that time period, which is when I got introduced to it, and then 2015 to 2018. Right, in 2015 to 2018, Professor Singh and I met in that context, and we both had very key roles, and we kind of intersected each other in the middle of the process. He was very involved in the first half, which was a process where they set the narrative, or they create a meta document that's for publishers that outlines what they want in the textbooks. And it was about a 60-page document if memory serves. And the prevalence of caste was something like 80%. And so Professor Singh wrote a very damning report, which was taken in backroom meetings by one of the groups and used to drive certain levels of change, and reduce that from 80% to 40%, if my numbers are correct. And then he had to leave for India. And in the second half, where the textbooks actually came out, the Hindupedia team reviewed all 7 of them, and all the intellectual work that was done was started with us and published in many different names and shared through many different organizations. And ultimately, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt was banned because of a letter that went under Hindupedia's own name. Now, Hindupedia is an ivory tower institution. We're very small in number. but we're focused on a very specific area that happens to be incredibly important because it is the fountainhead for everything else. And so this is where we get leverage, because what we fix here goes everywhere else. If we fix a textbook, if we fix the curricula, I should say, and the textbooks are good, suddenly every publisher is pushing those textbooks. And what's approved goes to 100 million children. And those children grow up to be tomorrow's policymakers and tomorrow's politicians and tomorrow's teachers. So you get leverage. And so we need to look for points of leverage, and we need to invest specifically in points of leverage because we need outsized returns for the dollars that we put in. The second thing is we're simply not investing enough also. Right? As a community, if we look at other communities, we underinvest in narrative control. And so then you get what you pay for. And this, I'm very American. Right? You get what you pay for, so you have to pay for it if you want it. And we as a community simply don't.
Yeah, that's
Because the
true.
work that we do, I am the only volunteer at Hindupedia. Everyone else is full-time. This is their 9-to-5 job. Because work like this cannot be done by volunteers after hours, after a long day of work. It's simply not sustainable. And we assume that it is, and we'll get mileage because of our own traditions around volunteer work in India. Right? And specifically, we think about our intellectual class not being salaried and in fact shunning wealth. At the same time, what we forget was they were supported by the community to make sure their needs were met. And they were supported by the kings to make sure their needs were met so they could pursue intellectual pursuits unbounded. And the reality is that support simply doesn't exist for our intellectuals today.
Another comment, if I could please make.
Go ahead.
Several years ago, there's a piece published, I think it was in Newsweek, if I remember correctly, the title of which was that we are all Hindus now. And they recited several different pieces of evidence how American society was becoming Hinduized, and not in practice, but in thought. And some of the points that they made is that in the Bible, Jesus said that I'm the way and the truth and the life. Nobody comes to the Father but by me. And this article indicated that very few Americans now believe in the exclusive claim of Christianity. And some of the other pieces of evidence were that cremation has increased by leaps and bounds. I think something like 50% of the people cremate the dead now in America as against burying them, which was the traditional method of disposing of the body. And it's a number of years ago, I read that piece. I don't recall all the other points that they're making, but essentially the point was that a number of the cultural characteristics of Hinduism are being adopted in the Western world. So I'm sure you're familiar with that piece and the argument along those lines. Any comment on that? It's America and the Western world which is buying into Hindu way of thinking than the other way around.
I think what I will leave you with that topic is Christianity has a history of cultural appropriation, and you're seeing nothing other than that.
I attend a Christian church here in Florida where I'm settled. And in the past few years, I'm up in years now, so I'm not doing that. I've lectured on Hinduism at the church on more than one church in Florida, in Western Florida. And it always have been well received. People come to me, talk with me, want to get some more literature. So I found Americans to be very open-minded, and this is South I'm settled in western part of Florida, not New York or Washington D.C. or anything like that. So my experience being settled in western part of Florida is that people are very open. Like I said, I attend on Sunday a Christian church, and I'm more than welcome to speak on Hinduism. Once I had offered a class on teaching Sanskrit and Hindu alphabet, and I had 30 students who joined in the church. We'll meet once a week, and I'll teach them about Sanskrit and Hindi alphabet and how it's put together. And I was just so impressed that 30 people in south of the United States were willing to join a course offered by me on Hindi and Sanskrit alphabet.
Yeah, Madanji, Professor Goyal, if I can make a comment on that, I think Krishna ji already answered that.
Oh, okay.
I don't know whether anybody picked up that signal or not, but his point is that the West and the Christianity, they have a long history of just taking, or even you can call it plagiarizing things from other cultures and making it their own. So let's not get bought into that somebody's listening or somebody's cremating their dead or somebody's doing yoga or what Christianity is a very deceitful system, or church. They will absorb things and they will just simply claim these are Christian things. They will say cremation is Christian. Nothing stops them. They'll say yoga is Christian. But that aggression of Christianity and that Jesus paradigm will continue. So I don't think we can look at these developments as beneficial to Hindu dharma or humanity or anything like that. As far as historical, a lineage of just stealing other people's or other cultures goes in terms of Christianity. That was the point.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, this brings us to the end of this event. I thank wholeheartedly to Krishna ji for sharing his knowledge, insights, and promptly answering all the questions. We are looking forward to reading your book. I also thank all participants for attending this event and making it an interactive one. Recording will be available on our YouTube channel. You can register for the next events on our website, Indic Forum. See you all in the next one. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Namaste.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.